What added value, if any, does Pesco provide for the European continent's military capabilities?
Thank you very much for the question. I think Pesco stands to provide some added value in the practical sense, and I'm sure that we will dive in due course into the possibility of military mobility, which obviously has some potential practical benefits. But I would draw attention to the assumption behind the question that Pesco does have net added value. Pesco originates in the Lisbon Treaty, although it obviously came into being in 2017, and so is a part of an overall project towards the centralisation and the harmonisation of defence on the European continent. So I think that the UK policy makers in general should be wary, is my overall top line, of even ad hoc cooperation with and in Pesco-led projects. And just by way of example, although the UK position, government position, springing from the political declaration 2019, is that participation would only be on an exceptional basis in Pesco. We have received warnings, for example, from the former CEO of the EDA, that have stated that any third-party involvement in Pesco would, by implication, lead to the support by a third-party country of the common security and defence policy. So my overall take is that we should be careful of claims of net added value.
May I just ask a supplementary to that? Do you see the situation in the European continent at the moment sufficiently a matter of concern because of all the activities that are going on in Ukraine and throughout the rest of the world, in fact, which gives special reasons for being insistent that NATO has to be at the heart of this, and that anything that Pesco does would effectively be an adjunct to it? In other words, I want to nail down this simple question. NATO comes first, does it not, as compared to ancillary activities which may or may not be beneficial? Radomir Tylecote, please.
Thank you for that. So the overall sense that I think most people get from the Western response to the Ukraine, which is that there was a change of habit in British leadership, and I refer in particular to the previous Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was able to act independently and was no longer a part of a culture that expected him to refer to Brussels before I think it's fair to say leading the Western defence of the Ukraine and setting the pace. So I think the conclusion to be drawn from the continuing Russian invasion of Ukraine is probably not the continuing centralisation of defence policy in Brussels is going to improve the European defence situation. However, you asked about does NATO still come first, and I think the answer to that is yes, but I also think there is now a risk, partly because of the European Defence Fund and other aspects of European defence harmonisation, that this will not always be the case. And I'd like to draw your attention to two particular themes that I think are worthy of this committee's consideration. These are, in my view, likely to undermine the effectiveness of NATO in the years to come. The first is that in the 2021 regulation establishing the EDF, in Articles 23 and 20, which I won't go into ad nauseam, the meaning of these effectively is that if one of the 25 nations that cooperate within Pesco is funded by the EDF and wishes to transfer ownership over one of their Pesco projects to the UK or the United States, which obviously could be perceived as having different security interests, then you would have a 100% effective tax on any funding that had been granted via the EDF. So this is not only potentially protectionist, but it would seem to hinder NATO-oriented defence R&D and planning. And the next point that I think will call into question whether NATO comes first by European Union members is that Lisbon gave the EU its own version of NATO, Article 5 on collective security, and we see that in Article 42, which is a collective defence obligation that appears to have binding legal effect, and I think the committee should take this very seriously. Could this be legally superior to the mutual defence commitment in Article 5? That needs to be understood to understand why or whether EU countries will continue to see NATO as the first port of call.
Do you think that Pesco has the potential to impact, whether positively or negatively, on the UK's strategic autonomy? And how do you feel about more bilateral arrangements with potential EU allies?
So, I think that the risk to UK strategic autonomy is probably best analysed through the lens of the military mobility question, but I would like to allude to a couple of things that Ms. Wright has said. I'm not the first person to observe that the attitude of the Elysee Palace to both NATO and the Ukraine can be typified as somewhat enigmatic, and I don't claim to understand the exact rationales of what President Macron has just said. That said, whether Franco-British collaboration in the defence sphere improves will be down to the administrations in both countries. We have, however, seen continuing strong bilateral defence cooperation by the UK, including with France, and that's shown in the Lancaster House Agreement of 2010, but that was a part of a British approach that prioritised the ad hoc and the bilateral over the multilateral, and I think this was maintained to a degree through our membership of the European Union. Why has there been such a strong concern in this country that this should remain the case? I think what we're getting towards here is a fundamental philosophical concern, which is the existence of a state is understood to depend on the monopoly on violence, among other things. And if that monopoly on the use of force begins to drift towards unelected bodies in Brussels, I think we are increasingly asking whether European states remain viable, and I don't want to speculate too far, but I think this awareness is one of the things that is going to bog down Pesco, and is another reason why members of Pesco are not meeting their binding commitments, so 2% spending, data sharing, and so on, and I'm happy to submit more written evidence on that point. I think continued UK interest in even third-party affiliations and PESCO-led projects, and military mobility is, of course, a project that arises from PESCO and exists to continue the development of the common security policy, are also likely to distract this country from, in my view, more useful defence partnerships such as AUKUS and building AUKUS. So overall, I think that's my take.
You mentioned AUKUS, but the United States seems quite comfortable with participation in military mobility.
It does, and I think NATO is also comfortable with the European Union going ahead with this project, and the current view in NATO is that it's better done within the EU, although we should very strongly support NATO, and even more than we have done in the last 10 years. It doesn't mean that what NATO does and says is necessarily gospel, and I think what we need to be alert to is not just the risks for sovereignty that are presumably contained within the administrative agreement, which we need to be able to see. It's that there might be, even though NATO's intentions are good, there might be some kind of opportunity cost here for NATO. So if we become accustomed to the EU developing military mobility, what else does that mean? Does that mean that there is defence funding, R&D funding that is channeled through the EDF for this project that then has strings attached, that then has protectionist elements that I've alluded to? So I think it's not that NATO is necessarily wrong or the United States is necessarily wrong, but what is beginning as a limited project in this case is always liable to come with strings attached. I think that's the main caution.
And Dr. Tylecote, you just referenced the EDF, the European Defence Fund, in your answer. Can you expand a little bit more on the implications for the EU defence funding programmes like the EDF to the United Kingdom, particularly given the number of defence contractors that we already have in the United Kingdom that clearly serve a global market, including the continent of Europe? What was going to be the practical outrun of this if UK defence contractors are essentially frozen out?
Thank you. I'd return to some of the indications that have been appearing since 2019 to 2020 that EDA and EDF participation are likely to imply support for other Pesco aims like CSDP. I think it's worth pondering a couple of examples of protectionism that we're seeing arise, and that's it's worth investigating intellectual property controls, particularly where non-EU countries will be unable to access IP that is ultimately European Union funded. And you mentioned defence corporates and investment, and I think it's also reasonable that the United States has noted the emergence of what it calls a bi-European preference. Part of this is because of ITAR, so ITAR meaning International Traffic in Arms Regulations. This is a US set of regulations whereby non-US companies need prior approval for the re-export of sensitive material, and European procurement seems to be increasingly excluding ITAR-restricted products from procurement. What does this demonstrate? The EU model inherently involves the harmonisation of technological standards, and it now involves the harmonisation of defence IP. I think what the last generation or so has taught us is that European prosperity over the last 300 years was based on competition between companies, and it was based on competition between nation states in terms of technological standards, in terms of business law and so on, and this allowed our economies to grow and improve. The fact that the defence area, including R&D, is now being harmonised around one unified European set of standards, I think, is inherently anti-competitive and likely to slow growth. So I would also suggest to the committee that we shouldn't take our eye off that ball. There are fundamental questions for European defence and sovereignty directly, but there are also questions about future growth and prosperity and this continuation of the European model.
The EU and NATO have acknowledged that a stronger NATO and a stronger EU are mutually reinforcing. What does Pesco offer that is significantly different to NATO? Could I ask you, Dr. Tylecote, first, please?
So by way of answer, I'd also like to allude to some of the things that Ms. Wright has said, because I think it is fundamentally different. I agree that it's not the case that Pesco will become a new NATO. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a risk of Pesco supplanting NATO. And I agree with Ms. Wright that it is not the intention of member states in general for Pesco to supplant NATO, but it doesn't necessarily need to be at this stage. What do I mean by this? I do believe that there is a risk of Pesco or EU defence harmonisation to some degree supplanting NATO, and I've talked about the comparison of the articles dealing with mutual defence. In the binding requirements of Pesco, whether or not member states are meeting them, there is the discussion about committing spending and harmonising R&D, data sharing, and so on. This is a question about budgets that are already under pressure and where defence budgets go to, where they're dedicated. But to the point of, is it a new NATO and how does it complement or contrast with NATO? Again, Ms. Wright mentioned the fact that nations are not somehow dominated by the European Commission in defence decision-making at this stage. While that's true, we have recently had a call from Ursula von der Leyen, among other people, to create an EU Defence Commissioner. So I think, again, with respect to Ms. Wright, she's describing the status quo, but where does the Commission intend to go? And what does this mean for freedom of action, and what does this mean for Pesco? Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, has argued against the existence of an EU Defence Commissioner. Again, he has said this is because it would risk duplicating, not identically, but duplicating NATO structures, and doing so in a I would say the most closed-door EU body, whose decisions are simply, as a matter of fact, made behind closed doors. We also have to understand the environment in which these proposals are being made. Just some examples of this are that in May 2021, the German foreign minister asked for the national veto to disappear. So this is a question of the extension of QMV, qualified majority voting, not directly a Commission issue, but into the defence sphere. So I think there is a risk of not the replication of NATO, but the supplanting of NATO, distraction from NATO, and the centralisation of decision-making over defence questions. Sorry.
Are you aware of what the British government's position is on having this commissioner?
The current position?
Yes.
I believe the current British government is not in favour of this,
Okay,
but that's moot as to what
Future,
happens in
of
due
course.
course.
Exactly.
Perhaps I'll come to you, Mr. Tylecote, first, if that's okay. Given some of the contributions you've made and the challenge to Ms. Wright as well about the future of Pesco and its interaction with NATO, do you have any confidence that Pesco and the strands that it has at the moment will be an exception, or do you see future expansion of Pesco and therefore a threat to NATO?
Well, I think I've expressed my view about the threat to NATO, and I think I should emphasise I think this is a kind of an indirect supplanting and distraction as far as the threat goes. I'd phrase my answer in two ways. In terms of expansion, there are simply practical questions, and the European Union member states, especially in Eastern Europe, I'm thinking of the Poles and the Czechs above all, are increasingly concerned about what Pesco could mean for their national sovereignty and their freedom of action in national defence. Again, on the practical side, the successes or lack of the military mobility project could tell us that these projects are likely to be limited in success and become bogged down. So I think one way of measuring the success of military mobility could be the money spent, which is so far, I understand, 3.7 billion euros. But on the other hand, what has it achieved? So the projects indeed, as Ms. Wright has said, are largely aimed at improving rail, road and airport capacity. But progress is actually rather slow. And again, I'm happy to submit more written evidence on this in terms of achievements on the ground. And there are some slightly predictable new requirements that I think are bogging down progress and are likely to bog down progress in this area because of the other agendas in which the EU involves itself. So one example here is that the joint communication on a new outlook on climate and security under the EDA will now look at ways that militaries can reduce their fossil fuel reliance. So I think there's likely to be a kind of a bureaucratic drift and levels of bureaucratic distraction. However, we have to keep intention in mind, and the trend in the European Union since the Maastricht Treaty especially has been towards centralisation of decision making. And another example, I mentioned the German foreign minister. Another example is that the High Representative Josep Borrell has also called for the national veto to be removed and unanimity in military decision making to be rendered unnecessary. So it's hard to predict the levels of success, quote unquote, that Pesco will see. But I think these two tensions between member states, especially in Eastern Europe, and a strong centralising intent, particularly under the Commission, will be crucial.
I'm finding this really quite hard to understand because clearly NATO and the European Union have a shared interest in military mobility. The United Kingdom is a prominent member of the NATO alliance. If these arrangements didn't exist, surely it would still be possible for NATO to cross the continent of Europe without someone stopping them at a boundary and saying, papers, please. So I'm finding it hard to see what really what real value there is there, and I'd like Dr. Tylecote to comment on this too.
Thank you. So I'll try and answer both of your questions. First on the practical value of military mobility. I think it's important to remember that military mobility as a project exists within and under Pesco. Why was Pesco, springing from the Lisbon Treaty, described as the sleeping beauty of the Lisbon Treaty by then President Juncker? I think let's just ponder that a little bit. It's because Pesco contains binding commitments in 20 areas. And one of these deals with investment expenditure, and these are designed to increasingly harmonise investment expenditure. We've heard an allusion to the European industrial base and so on. In the EDF regulations, and this is why I do want us to ponder growth and prosperity and protectionism, and how even an apparently limited project is a stepping stone towards the development of Pesco. In EDF regulations, it describes that R&D projects, and we assume these will appear as a result of military mobility, will be selected in part on, I quote, their contribution to the autonomy of the European defence technological and industrial base, including by increasing non-dependency on non-union sources. So this is protectionist in intent. It's anti-competitive in intent. And it also discusses, again, happy to submit written evidence, how awards will be made and the closed-door nature of these awards. So that's another area where I think there should be an alarm bell about even apparently ad hoc projects under Pesco. If we could just turn to the administrative arrangement, with respect to what Ms. Wright has said, I think it's worth breaking down where that is, at least where I understand that is. So the administrative arrangement clearly warrants proper parliamentary scrutiny. That's the first point. When the UK was accepted into military mobility, the project military mobility in 2022, there wasn't parliamentary debate, and the question is the way open for the UK to be drawn further into EU defence structures? Because we can assume this agreement will deal with the scope of the UK's participation, conditions for its review, the disclosure of sensitive information, and so on. And the issue is, will the commitments be legally binding? And I think the evidence increasingly suggests that they will. When we look at the Council decision in 2020, again coming to you in written evidence, on establishing the general conditions under which third states could exceptionally be invited to participate in individual Pesco projects, such as this, we note language that implies a binding agreement. I'd just like to briefly quote. It states that third states may be exceptionally invited by project participants. They would need to provide substantial added value to the project, contribute to strengthening Pesco and the common security and defence policy, and meet, I emphasise, more demanding commitments. So there are various doors that I think are opening here. You, I think, are about to hear from the Minister, and no doubt the status of that agreement and whether it will be made public anytime soon will be a big interest of yours. But I think until we know whether Parliament can scrutinise the administrative agreement and everything that is in it and all its legally binding implications or otherwise, my view is to treat the project with great caution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're running tight on time at the moment, and we have the Minister coming immediately after you. But I just simply want to wrap up by asking a very direct question, and I want a short answer, if I may. Are we going to have an EU army or not? Just quickly, Dr. Tylecote, have we got the prospect of an EU army as the National Foreign Minister for Italy, Antonio Tajani, suggested recently? That's what he said he wanted. We should have our own army. I mean, not us, but the European Union should have its own army, yes or no? I mean, can I ask both of you very quickly to answer that question?
Shall I begin?
If you would.
Well, forgive me, I can't quite say yes or no. I can say it remains to be seen, and as concisely as possible, this depends on the two competing dynamics that I've described and how they play out. There is already an embryonic European army in the form of the EU battle groups, and although there is a plan to increase their number from 1,500 to 5,000 personnel by 2025, this is a merely conceptual entity, so it doesn't yet exist. That said, and I refer to my previous comments about the potential commissioner and the general centralising intent, the creation of a functioning EU army would entail and require the full federalisation of the European Union as a bloc.
Listening to this discussion, and we have the Minister to come very shortly, if you think about what happened with Ukraine, it happened very quickly. Some of the things that come out of these discussions, I have to say throughout the whole of our inquiry into this, and it's not just this session, has a slightly unreal quality to it as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I was born on the very day, at the very time when Hitler invaded Holland and France in 1940 on May the 10th. It happened then. These questions and discussions that go on about how it's going to be done, all the administrative arrangements, is it legally binding and the rest of it, have a way of just disappearing in a puff of smoke if somebody does decide preemptive action. Are you satisfied with the state of affairs regarding defence in the EU as well as in the UK and in NATO, that we will be ready if anything unfortunate really did happen and happen quite quickly? Could I ask Radomir Tylecote first of all to answer that question? Or are you concerned, as I am, that there's an awful lot of administrative discussion and may not be enough readiness?
So, thank you. The degree to which I'm dissatisfied with that readiness in this increasingly uncertain world that you describe is because my concern is that there is confusion growing because of the centralisation and the development of EU defence harmonisation about which mechanism would likely lead, and I include the concept of what you would call charismatic authority about where these discussions are happening, and I think for those things to remain in NATO, just because of the growing risk of that kind of eventuality, is increasingly important.